Mr. President, Excellencies, permanent representatives, ladies and gentlemen, delegates. It's been almost 2 years since President Barack Obama announced his willingness to use his executive powers and engage the U.S. Congress with the purpose of lifting the blockade against Cuba. During this period, the 3 Cuban anti-terrorists returned to their homeland. The unjustifiable inclusion of Cuba in the so-called list of states sponsoring international terrorism was abrogated. Diplomatic relations were re-established between the countries and embassies were reopened in the respective capitals. President Obama, the Secretary of State, and other members of the U.S. government's cabinet, including senators, representatives, and personalities of broad sectors of the American society, visited Havana. There is no doubt that progress has been made in terms of dialogue and cooperation in areas of common interest, and a dozen agreements rendering reciprocal benefits have been signed. However, the United States has just voted to abstain from this draft resolution. However, the economic, commercial, and financial blockade persists. It causes harm to the Cuban people and impairs the country's economic development. Given its marked extraterritorial character, the blockade also affects directly all the UN member states. The U.S. President, as well as other high officials, has described it as obsolete, useless to advance U.S. interests, a failed, nonsensical, and unviable policy, a burden to all citizens that harms the Cuban people and plunges the United States into isolation, which should be lifted. However, it has taken 24 years to change the single vote of the United States of America in this hall. It's been 24 years, as Ambassador Samantha Power has said, of isolation and failure. 58 years of heroic resistance of our people are the basis of what has occurred. At this time, I'm thinking of my people, of Fidel and Raul, of the young Cubans who have inherited this long, glorious struggle. Some people asked me, why are you submitting this resolution again to the General Assembly? I can in no way underestimate the powerful political and moral message that this assembly is sending to the people of the world. Truth always opens up the way. Justice ends by being imposed. The vote on abstention, which has just been announced, is certainly a positive step for the future of improving the relations between the United States and Cuba. I am grateful for the words and the efforts made by Ambassador Samantha Power. Most of the executive regulations, as well as the laws that establish the blockade, however, are still in force and are fully implemented to date by the U.S. government agencies. We recognize that the executive measures adopted by the U.S. government have been positive steps, but with a very limited scope and effect. The actions taken in the area of telecommunications, unfortunately, pursue openly declared political and interventionist objectives, but they show how broad the faculties of the president are, who, in the future, if he wants to, have commercial relations, private credit, and investment credits in all sectors of the Cuban economy. The measures relating to commercial operations with small private businesses, also inspired by express political motivation, unfortunately will not work at a substantial scale as long as the economic organization and commercial structures of Cuba's foreign trade are not taken into account. Nevertheless, they show that in the area of trade, progress could also be made even if the blockade laws remain unchanged. Some U.S. spokespersons have stated that the Cuban system is the one that hinders the implementation of such measures. They know that this is not true. It's the blockade laws which determine today's realities. It is well known and notorious that the President of the United States has ample executive prerogatives which he has not fully used, as he could still do, to substantially modify the practical implementation of the blockade and its economic and humanitarian impact. This change in the vote does it mean that it will be used with determination? Only 12 days ago, the Treasury and the Commerce Departments announced new measures, which, although positive, have a very limited scope. Most of them are aimed at expanding previously authorized transactions, and rather than benefiting Cuba and the Cuban people, they favor the United States. There is one funny piece of news. From now on, U.S. citizens who are authorized by their government to visit Cuba, or those who travel to other countries, will be allowed to buy and take with them, as part of their personal luggage, Cuban products with no limit in value, including rum and tobacco. However, the export of those products to the United States continued to be banned. However, these products cannot be exported to the United States. And why so? Unless there are specific licenses, the new measures do not allow for U.S. investments in our country, nor mixed-end businesses, not even for the production of Cuban pharmaceutical or biotechnical products whose marketing and distribution to the United States have been authorized, fortunately, if and when they receive approval from the Food and Drug Administration. Neither are there allowed exports to Cuba beyond the previously authorized limited sales, which exclude the key sectors of the Cuban economy. Nor have there been any new changes in the financial sector, which maintains that Cuban banking institutions are still not allowed to open correspondent accounts in U.S. financial institutions. For its part, the United States Congress has not approved any of the 20 amendments or bills that, with a bipartisan support, are intended to eliminate some of the restrictions imposed by the blockade or that policy as a whole. Quite on the contrary, more than 50 legislative initiatives have been introduced that threaten to reinforce some fundamental aspects of the implementation of the blockade and prevent the President from approving new executive measures or obstruct the implementation of those already approved. Neither have there been any specific efforts made by the government in this respect. Therefore, it is necessary to judge the facts. What is important and concrete is the dismantling of the blockade, rather than speeches, press declarations, or even the vote of one delegation in this hall. I repeat, it is necessary to judge by the facts. The human damages caused by the blockade are incalculable. There isn't any Cuban family or sector in our country that has not suffered from its effects. Its impact has been felt in the areas of health, education, food, services, commodity prices, salaries, and pensions. The imposition of discriminatory and onerous conditions, together with the dissuasive effects of the blockade, restricts the purchases of food as well as pharmaceuticals, reagents, spare parts for medical equipment, and instruments, among other products, in the U.S. market. The U.S. company Medtronic was unable to sign contracts with Cuban companies for the sale of deep brain stimulators to treat Cuban patients suffering from Parkinson's disease and other neurological disorders, including restrictions imposed by the blockade. Neither was it possible for the multinational Sigma Aldrich to supply the protection means or the chemical and biotechnical products ordered by the Cuban company Cuba for the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals in Cuba. In May of this year, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States notified the branch office in this company of the German company Eckert and Ziegler that it would deny any license application to supply the Dutch company Philips with the calibration sources required by a medical equipment that was purchased by the Institute of Oncology of Cuba in 2013, thus affecting a service that is vital for cancer patients. On September the 26th last, the Italian medical equipment supplier Emil notified the Cuban company Medicuba that the U.S. company Boston Scientific Corporation refused to sell to it a Cosman radio frequency generator used in cancer diagnosis. The blockade also affects the interests of the U.S. citizens themselves, who could benefit from various services that are offered in Cuba, among them the health services. I thank Ambassador Samantha Power for his words about the symbolic case of Dr. Felix Sarria Rice. This is an example of everything that could be done when international cooperation prevails. However, I cannot remain silent that at the tragic moments of the Ebola virus epidemic in West Africa, the deployment of Cuban medical assistance was hampered by the refusal of the British Standard Chartered Bank to make transfers between the World Health Organization and the brigades of Cuban doctors, including Dr. Saria Weiss, who were risking their lives by being in direct contact with patients. And even under such extreme circumstances, the issuance of specific licenses by the Treasury Department was required. The branch office of that bank in Uganda has just closed the private accounts of the Cuban health workers in that country. And the branch office of Barclays Bank, which is also British, prevents them from making transfers to Cuba. The same occurs with the Cuban cooperation personnel working in other countries in the area of education. These are examples which demonstrate the complexity of the reality between the United States and Cuba. But it is encouraged, the approach made this morning is really good. With the change in vote of the United States, we must ask ourselves whether this will continue. In 2016, we couldn't transfer ophthalmology services in Algeria because of the corresponding banks, the Aleman Commerzbank and the KBC Bank could not take place because of the shameful Cuban medical professional parole program designed for the Cuban health staff working in other countries. The United States attempts to impede medical cooperation and deprive those peoples and our own from highly qualified and indispensable human resources. Last month, several banks based in Pakistan refused to open a letter of credit requested by a company of that country for the purchase of 100,000 vaccines against hepatitis B on the grounds that Cuba was a country under the U.S. sanctions system. Still in force is a legal ban that prevents U.S. citizens from freely traveling to Cuba, which is a violation of their civil liberties and rights, although travels have been facilitated through general licenses only in the case of the 12 categories that were legally authorized by that country. Any U.S. citizen would be under threat of a $100,000 fine for traveling to Cuba with several companions. The blockade continues to be a massive, flagrant, and systematic violation of the human rights of all Cuban men and women, and qualifies as an act of genocide pursuant to the Geneva Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948. It is also an obstacle to international humanitarian cooperation. Between April 2015 and March 2016, the economic damage caused to Cuba directly by the blockade were worth more than $4.680 billion at current prices, according to rigorous, prudent, and conservative calculations. The damages accumulated for almost 6 decades as a result of the implementation of this policy amount to $753.688 billion, taking into account the depreciation of gold. At current prices, this figure is equivalent to more than $125 billion. The blockade is the main obstacle to the economic and social development of our people. It constitutes a violation, a flagrant violation of international law. The United Nations Charter and the Proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. Its extraterritorial implementation adds a new dimension to its character as a violation of international law. How can one object to that statement? It suffices to read the legal text. Was good news that an announcement was made by the U.S. Treasury Department this March, allowing my country to use the U.S. dollar in its international transaction. But so far, Cuba has not been able to make payments or cash deposits in that currency due to the fines that have been imposed and the intimidating effects of the blockade. And in third countries, there has been ceasing of operations, the closing of Cuban banks abroad, the denial of credits, and the refusal to make transfer to and from Cuba in third countries. And this has also increased. In trying to have access to the website of the Norton company, of the Semantic company, which provides services to block and eliminate malicious software, a warning pops up which reads as follows: under the U.S. applicable laws, we are unable to process your request. Many others respond that the user has no permit to get the address of an internet site from this server, or simply access denied. Other cases, besides the blockade, determine economic problems, like the unjust international economic order, the global crisis, the historical distortions and structural weaknesses of underdevelopment, the high dependence on energy and food imports, the effects of climate change and natural disasters, and also, and we do not hide it, our own mistakes. Both our people and government are struggling very hard to overcome this reality. Mr. President, on April 17, 2016, President Raúl Castro Ruz stated, "We have the will to develop a respectful dialogue and build a new type of relation with the United States, as has never before existed between the two countries, because we are convinced that it can only bring mutual benefits." And on the 17th of December, only a few days ago, he added, "We ratify our will to have a relation of civilized coexistence with the United States. But Cuba will not give up one of its principles or make concessions inherent in its sovereignty and independence." End of quotation. Looking back in history, the U.S. government attempted, first of all, the annexation of Cuba, and failing that, to exert its domination on the country. Upon the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, it pursued to create, and I quote, "disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government." While the Presidential Policy Directive, published on October 14th of this year, affirms that the U.S. government recognizes Cuba's sovereignty and self-determination, and that it is up to the Cuban people to make their own choices about their future. Its deceitful language does not hide the purpose of altering the constitutional order and bring about changes in the economic, political, social, and cultural system of Cuba. Nor does it hide the intention to continue to implement interventionist programs that serve the U.S. interests and involve specific sectors of the Cuban society. The directive says they are not seeking to impose regime change on Cuba, but admits that, and I quote, that the United States will support Cuba's emerging civil society and will encourage partners and non-governmental actors to join us in advocating for reforms. It states, while the United States remains its commitment to support democratic activists, we will also engage community leaders, bloggers, activists, and other social issue leaders who can contribute to Cuba's internal dialogue on civic participation. Continues, the directive continues, United States will maintain our democracy and broadcasting programs while protecting our interests and assets, such as the Guantanamo Bay Naval Station. The United States government has no intention to altering the existing lease treaty and other related arrangements. Upon introducing the declaration, it was said, and I quote, "We cannot simply stand back and wait for Cuba to change without involving ourselves." The directive states that Cuba, and I quote, "remains in default to the United States government on pre-Cuban Revolution bilateral debts." Maybe they think that the Cuban Revolution has to pay for the debt for the bloody revolution of Batista. They should understand that we're already free, precisely because in 1959 we rid ourselves of the U.S. imperialism and the dictatorship it imposed on us. George W. Bush's initiative for a new Cuba of May 19, 2002, which intended to condition a relaxation of the travel and trade bans to internal political and economic changes, was responded to by Cubans on the June 26th of this year with 8 million signatures in support of the constitutional amendment which proclaims the irrevocable character of socialism in Cuba, which in our country. It would be worthwhile acknowledging that changing Cuba is a sovereign right of Cubans, and Cuba is a truly independent country. It is so because it achieved its independence on its own and has defended and will continue to defend it at the price of the greatest sacrifices and risks. You must know that our people conquered power. It empowered itself long ago, and day after day it exercises the sovereign power, the people's power. That is why we are here today. We are proud of our history and our culture, which are our most prized treasure. We'll never forget our past, because that's the only way to never go back to it. We have already chosen our path to the future, and we know that it will be long and difficult, but we will not divert our course out of naivete or by mistake. There is no force on earth capable of forcing us to do that. We have seen many dreams come true, both ours and others that we have shared with other people. We have plenty of dreams that are yet to be realized, but they are our dreams. We don't need dreams that are alien to our culture or to our history. The Cuban Revolution was made and is being made every day by the youth and for the youth. And while the Cuban youth resemble their times more than they resemble their parents, they are as patriotic and anti-imperialist as their parents and grandparents. We have and we will defend our own values and symbols, which we will continue to enrich. But they'll always be Cuban. We will never change them for others that are strange to us. We will struggle to build a sovereign, independent, socialist, democratic, prosperous, and sustainable nation. We will never go back to capitalism. As was stated by the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro, on April 19th last, we will perfect whatever needs to be perfected with utmost loyalty and united force, as was done by Martí, Maceo, and Gomez in an unstoppable march. Mr. President, distinguished permanent representative delegates, lifting the blockade is the key to be able to advance towards the normalization of relations with the United States. It is what will give some meaning, depth, and soundness to what has been achieved so far. The blockade is unjust, inhuman, immoral, and illegal, and should unilaterally and unconditionally cease. The change in vote, which Ambassador Samantha Power has just announced, is a promising signal. We hope that it will be reflected in reality. We are deeply grateful to all governments and peoples, parliaments, political forces, and social movements, representatives of civil society, international and regional organizations who have contributed their voices and votes year after year to substantiate the fairness and urgency of the abolishment of the blockade. We would like to convey our sincere gratitude to the U.S. people for their ever-growing support of this lofty purpose. Thank you very much.
The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/71/L3 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. A recorded vote has been requested, so we shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/71/L3 are asked to please signify, and those against and abstentions. But before doing so, I give the floor to the representative of the Secretariat for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. The General Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/71/L3, entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? Okay, you have 193. The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
So the result of the vote is as follows: in favor 191, against 0, and abstentions 2. Draft resolution A/71/L3 is adopted.